And I'm looking around for my panelists. There we are. I'm not really going to try and introduce these people, not in a gathering like this, but Professor Manoj Ladwa, do come up. And Shefali Goradia, Chairperson, South Asia and partner, Deloitte, India. Shefali, come here. Manoj, come there. Doing well.
Good, good.
I'm going to dive straight into it. But first of all, I think starting to ask the first question, is there a difference in leadership style between men and women? That is the question which was asked right now, and I think that's why we are segueing away into this. Is there a difference in leadership style between men and women, and if so, what is that difference?
Hi, I believe there is a difference, but again, I think it's more of an evolving trend that you see today, the leadership style, even when men are leading the organizations, it is different from when it was before. And of course, Som in the previous panel put it beautifully. I think now the leaders are far more open to expressing the vulnerability, which was not the case earlier. Earlier, if you were the leader of the organization, you had to sound very confident, you know it all, very decisive, lead from the front. But now, and especially now, the organizations, they are dealing more with the millennials and the Gen Zs. They are far more open to expressing their vulnerability because that's also showing their authenticity. They are bringing their authentic self out and putting right in front. And that's actually bringing the organizations far more closely together.
So you're saying if there was a gap earlier, that gap is now starting to blur?
It's starting to blur because it's a change in the leadership style. And I wouldn't attribute only to men, men or women, but it is just a new trend where people are no longer afraid of showing their vulnerability.
Manoj, is there a difference in leadership style, you think, between men and women?
I think there is. Okay, and I started off my legal career, my first boss was a woman. And if I look back on it, I learned a lot from her. She eventually became my colleague, and that was, I guess I was pretty good, but also she was very good as well. And we became partners in the same law firm. But if I reflect back, I think Shefali is absolutely right. At that time, and I'm talking about 25 odd years ago, my boss, as a woman, I could see her having to try much, much harder to prove herself within an otherwise male-dominated environment. That sense of having to give up things in order to be able to be at the same table at that time. I think it's much, much more natural now. And I look at our own organization at India Global Forum. I'm proud to say over 50% of my colleagues are women, and 80% of our top leadership are women. And that's not because Manoj sat down and made this massive grand plan that this is the sort of ratio that I wanted. It's over the last few years, it's just been a natural progression to where we are. So in echoing Shefali's point, I think I can empathize with it, and I can see that it has become much, much more natural, much, much more easy, if I could say, to have women around the table and have those conversations and have them as leaders within organizations than it was a generation ago. It's normal.
And it's interesting you say that, because a country like India, for example, which quite often people say that, women are discriminated against, and of course they are in X number of areas. But it's interesting that in some areas, such as the glass ceiling, countries like India are actually more progressive than many others. And I'll just give you a small example and try and get you to answer that. A researcher had once come from a foreign university to me and was doing a research on, do women really have freedom and do they have gender equality in corporate boardrooms? And I felt that one of the reasons why India was advanced is when she was asking in many companies, including mine, who are the managing directors and who are the managing editors and how many of them are men and women, I could not give the number between men and women. And that, in many ways, I feel is real equality when a person is there as the boss, and whether that person's a male or a female doesn't matter, it doesn't enter your head. Would you agree with that?
So
Is that the ultimate equality?
I mean, that's what we should all be aiming for, but I don't think we are there yet.
Okay.
So Deloitte has published a report, which is Women in the Boardroom, and that has some interesting statistics. It does show, I mean, of course, in the Indian context, if you see, to the extent of mandatory requirement, most of the public companies have the women on board. But other than that, the voluntary, directors are very few yet. We are not there yet. Also, I think there is an Egon Zehnder report which talks about in order for women to be effective in the boardroom, you need at least 30% representation. So one woman in the board is not sufficient, because then the woman is not able to openly voice out her opinion or ask the questions. You need a little critical mass. And this is what the Egon Zehnder report says, that you need at least 2 to 3 women for them to really function effectively on the board. But clearly, yes, I mean, if we stop discriminating, or if we stop really isolating in our mind, how many men, how many women, then we've arrived. But I think we are still far from there yet.
Manoj, are we far from it, or do you think it is starting to happen that at least in some areas, some companies, when you're selecting people, you're not really counting whether you're not actually trying to really assess whether that person's a male or a female, and there's no quota system as such, but it's happening organically. So are we at that stage yet or not?
No, we're not. And I recall a conversation last year at IGF here when we launched our Women in Forum, and Laura coincidentally asked me this question in terms of the purpose of the forum and what's your vision for the forum. And I said my vision is very simple, that within the next 3 to 5 years, or as soon as possible, I would like to collapse this forum. And that is when when it's irrelevant to have a specific women-focused conversations on platforms like this. There will be areas and certain subjects where it may be relevant to have a men-focused conversation, or a women-focused conversation, or a trans-focused conversation. But my vision is that these sorts of conversations we need to work towards collapsing them. And in order to do that, either there will be enlightened leadership that leads to a point that this is no longer an issue, or you've got to look at the statistics, look at the rules, regulations, and recruitment policies, and go in a very, very determined way to make it happen. So, and I think a lot of companies have to do that.
Well, coming back to your point about having a critical mass, it's interesting when it comes to looking up to a female boss or accepting female leadership. If you look at South Asia, for example, I mean, India, of course, has had a woman prime minister. Look at the number of political parties that are headed by women. But it's not just India. It's Bangladesh, it's Sri Lanka, it's Pakistan. Even Pakistan's had a woman prime minister at a time when America, for example, has never had a female president. How do you explain this sort of a dichotomy that while you may refuse to accept female leadership in some areas, you're perfectly happy giving your entire country to a woman to run and say, you'll do a better job than the rest of us?
I think that's interesting, right? And I think that's also the difference between how politics is managed versus how corporate world is managed. And if you see, even within Asia, it is not really consistent. So while, of course, we have some good examples in whether it is India, Bangladesh, if you see Japan, they are really far, far behind in having women leaders in the corporate world. So I think it is something to do with, what is the expectation, right? The conventional sense, the women in certain societies are still expected to be largely managing homes. Only when they have an alternate arrangement in place can they step out into the corporate world. Whereas in the Western side, that's no longer the case. I think, both men and women have to work. And then whoever gets to rise, they rise. But somehow in their politics, I think, while of course, they don't have the president, they have a vice president, they're still struggling with how to get the diversity right. But I think it's in Asia particularly, it is also more of just how, the conditioning of the families and how even not just men, how even women think about it.
I'd like to pick up on actually this point that you've made, is that one of the solutions, and people think that this is a magic wand, is work from home. That, if we work from home is the great liberator for women, and therefore they will be able to contribute more to the workplace. They will be able to balance their home life, their kids, and their work. It may be true in certain cases, but if you actually if you really want to affect societal change, work from home to look after domestic chores should equally apply to men as it does to women, is the first thing. Secondly, what I've noticed, and again, these are societal observations. In some societies, in some communities, women actually want to work from the office in order to get away from they're not getting away from the responsibility, but sometimes I've got to use my words very carefully, the burdens or the chores or whatever at home, which they're otherwise expected to do, or the other pressures that come along with this. And so we've got to actually affect societal change, where work from home is not a woman's solution for all women. It's a solution for society if used in the right way and embraced by both men and women themselves.
So coming back to some of the differences and in leadership style, there will be some differences. I mean, obviously, everyone should be sharing the chores, and that should not become a distinguishing factor. But there will be some areas, for example, where there will be differences, and perhaps we have to figure out a way of making sure that that is taken on board, embraced, and we accept it and move on with it. Take an obvious example, maternity leave, right? I mean, it's but natural that maternity leave will have to be a longer time period than paternity leave. You should have paternity leave, by the way, which is very important. I was one of the first people to insist in one of my organizations, I have to get the right to get paternity leave. Why shouldn't I? But the time is different, right? So are those the sort of changes that we shouldn't shy away from? We should take them on board, embrace them, and saying, yes, this is the way it should be. And we have to find a way of evolving, getting leadership sorted around that. Yes, there'll be this gap, and then you'll carry on.
Well, look, you've got to take a principled position that, and my view has always been, is that we are all equal but differentiated. There are physiological differences that we have to acknowledge. And there are certain things that I've learned now with my executive leadership that I know there are certain things I should not say. Okay, we heard in the earlier panel, darling, for one of them. But more fundamentally, I've learned that to say to my willing colleagues, don't be so emotional. That is an absolute no-no, because it is so patronizing, and I've realized that actually there are different emotions sometimes at play, and those emotions are driven often by physiological reasons or their own circumstances, and therefore that can be there. But having said that, and again I'm qualifying it, I've also seen that true to be with some of my male colleagues as well. And so you've just got to judge each situation on its own and its own merit.
All right, so let me ask you that. Treat everybody absolutely equally, or accept that there are differences and embrace the differences?
I think accept that there are differences and embrace the differences. Because, both have their own strengths, and it's a package like anything else. But I would also say that in terms of just policies for the corporate world, we also need to be mindful that, women as gender, they behave differently. So for example, you would have fewer women raise their hands for leadership roles as compared to men. And there is research which shows that men would, take a leadership role even if they think that they are 70% there. But women will not do that unless they themselves are convinced that they can do the job 100% well. So, and very rarely, you really know whether you can do it or not, unless somebody really nudges you into it and you give it a shot. So women need a little more of hand-holding and pulling up to say that, yes, you can go for it, you can do it. So what's more important, apart from the policies that facilitate and give the flexibility to, work during certain periods, you also need that awareness and the policies that create that network of support group for the women. Because unless you build the pipeline, you will not see women on top. And it is very critical that you have a network which helps women stay on course and not just, fall by the side, when they're passing through certain critical phase or somebody's, needs care at home. You need that support system which keeps them on the job, on track on their careers during that phase.
So you said embrace the differences, and I'm going to ask you, then I'm going to come back to Manoj on that. What would be some of the differences? What would be some of the things that you feel that therefore women do better?
So, for example, if you recognize,
better at multitasking, better at
women are definitely
not good
better.
at work.
Women definitely are better at multitasking, hands down. But I think one of the things that women need a little more support with is networking. Women, because they have other responsibilities, do not go out enough to network. If they have to network, they would rather do it. So, again, there has been research that if you have, say, dinner events, fewer women attend because they might want to, they prefer to be back at home with their children. But if you have more lunch events, they are more likely to be there. I've seen, even leaders in Deloitte network who've changed the leadership style. So rather than inviting their teams over for, the happy hours, they would rather just, invite the teams over on the weekends at home, for the backyard barbecues, where the team gets to meet their family as well. So to see the more human side of it. So I think there are differences, there are nuances. There is nothing right or wrong. We just have to be cognizant of it and we need to embrace it.
I think you're evoking some thoughts and my own consciousness about this. That if I look at, our work is all about convening and bringing very interesting people like in this room together, and that requires a significant amount of networking. And I do encourage all my colleagues to go out and network. But at the end of an evening, I say to my female colleagues, when you get home, text me. I don't say that to my male colleagues. Is that good, bad? Is that, I don't know. But, these are the sorts of things that maybe there is that vulnerability, what Som spoke about earlier on, that means that, one just has to be conscious of when those networking moments happen and what one says. I'd be interested to see.
Actually, that's a really interesting question, and you can help us both in navigating that. Exactly the same question, like running an organization which has a very, very strong culture of saying no sexual harassment and complete equality. Interestingly, the only complaint that we ever got for discrimination or you're not being diverse was, why is it that you don't allow women to stay back and work, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, and then you're constantly harassing us and saying, how are you going home? And the answer was because you're worried about for your safety, right? It's Delhi and going back alone in an Uber at 11 o'clock is dangerous. They're saying, no, but you're not treating us equally.
Yeah, Vikram, the answer is, let it be the woman's choice.
Yeah.
Rather than, stereotyping, I'm sure that there are many women who are capable of taking care of their own security. Have arrangements in place so that, you're not taking it lightly, especially in more riskier countries or cities. So make arrangement, but let it be the woman's choice, whether she wants to work late or not.
Does that answer your question, Manoj?
I'd still ask them to WhatsApp me when they get home.
That's all right.
It just depends on where you are. You can't help but feeling them. Okay, let me just ask you a question that I think is worrying a lot of people. COVID, and in the period, there's a Deloitte study, for example, 10,000, the number of women who've left their jobs in the last few years. What's the reason for that? Is it burnout? Is it having to handle too many things? Is it a sense of we need different priorities in our life? Which is also happening.
It's all together, right? I mean, Vikram, if you see, whether it's the Deloitte report or many other reports that came out, COVID was really a big game changer. It was like a big reset for everybody. Not just women, even men. There are many men who left their, then current vocations and they switched track to something different. So I think that, and it's good, from time to time to have those events which really gets us thinking, what is it that we really want to do? And how do we want to do it? How much time do we want to give to our jobs versus to our family, to our own well-being? And the Deloitte survey on women at work shows that there were more women who wanted to go back to office precisely for the reason that Manoj mentioned, that if they continue working from home, it's more work hours for them, putting their home chores plus the office together. Whereas when they are out, and you're more tuned in to what you're doing. But I think in terms of mental health and well-being, this is something that has really risen to the top. And not just for women, even for men. Post-COVID, everybody's far more aware of it. So everybody wants to have far more, healthier life, spend time on their own, exercising, meditation, whatever they do, and not just, burn out early. So which is a good thing to do.
Okay.
Right.
My colleague, Dr. Ishita Mandarek, has written a fascinating article in Gulf News, I think it was last week, on breakthrough or burnout. And addressing specifically this issue for women. My only comment on that, when I read that entire article, is that it would equally apply to men as well. And post-COVID, we have become more conscious. I think that the COVID pause gave a lot of us a time to reflect upon what our priorities in life are and how we balance those things. I personally don't think of work as work, which is a good thing and perhaps a bad thing as well. So.
All right, I think we are flat out of time, but perhaps if I could just ask you one word each, right? If there was one leadership skill or leadership style that you would like to imbibe from your female colleagues or female boss like Dina, for example, what would that be?
Empathy.
Okay, empathy.
Empathy.
No, what would you like to imbibe from any of the male colleagues or male leaders?
Empathy. It's not only women's, territory.
Okay.
But it is a good leadership style.
That's interesting. So both want to imbibe empathy. So that's obviously a common feature that is looked up to. Thank you both so much for being with us. Let me find. There's Laura. So let me hand it back to you. Thank you.